All right, welcome back. We're on to topic 8.4, the spread of communism. So, the essential questions for this one is to what extent was land reform policies around the world successful? And to what extent were policies of communist states successful in completing their goals? So, these are two of the important questions I want you to keep in mind as we are moving forward with the information. So, basic context here. We've talked about in the past, like many countries around the world have a history of practicing certain economic policies, economic organizations, such as feudalism, capitalism, and colonialism. In every single one of these, there's always going to end up being people who benefit and people who are shortchanged. So this allows the creation of more stringent social classes based around the idea of land owning classes being more held in higher regard than your basic peasant classes, the people who work in the land and so forth. And during the Cold War, and as it goes on, it's going to be a lot of land reforms, a lot of them associated with communism, because remember, the goal of communism is try to end the social classes that divide people. And by doing the whole land reform thing and making it to where land is more available to the common person is part of that idea of trying to create social equality. And there's going to be various degrees of success around some of these policies in different countries. But that's why land reforms comes up becoming a central issue during the Cold War itself, because both ideologies are competing for more influence. And if you can influence like the greater portion of the population that were in many of these countries peasant farmers, then you have won your ability to justify your rule, so to say. All right. So let's start with the basic language of the curriculum. As a result of internal tensions and Japanese aggression, Chinese communists seized power. These changes in China eventually led to a communist revolution. We've talked about this previously, and this was going back to when we talked about in Unit 7 with after World War One. And if you need a refresher, it's in the topic 7.5 video that I put out last week. And when World War One had ended, Germany had lost their possessions, their lands in China. The Chinese helped support the Allies during World War One, thinking that they would get that land back, that German land, which was pretty valuable land, from my understanding. This did not happen, and that land ended up going into the hands of Japan. So that kind of created issues, and then it kind of led to a nationalist movement that ends up splitting into two different parts. There's a nationalist movement and the ideal of Western nationalism, Western ideals and such. That ends up being the nationalist group. And then there's some ones who reject a lot of the Western, colonialism and foreign influence in favor of something of more Marxist ideas. And that's what ends up becoming kind of the communist side of China. And so eventually there's, a revolution. The Japanese, when they come in to try to take over China during World War II, that revolution kind of puts it on halt, and both sides focus on trying to defeat Japan. But in the end, after Japan is defeated, China will go back to having a revolt, and then things will change. We'll talk about that a little bit more so later, okay? The other language of the curriculum that you should be aware of, and let me get myself out of the graph here, is the Great Leap Forward. So in Communist China, the government controlled the national economy. This is a total command economy that China is going to put together here through the Great Leap Forward, and often implementing repressive policies with negative repercussions to the population. And this is a graph that we're going to come back to and show how the policies of the Great Leap Forward does having some negative effects on the Chinese people. All right, so 1949, Mao Zedong, who is this gentleman right here. Gentleman is probably not the right term for him, but Mao Zedong is going to end up winning the civil war between the nationalist and the communist. During the Second World War, a lot of the peasant class people were very impressive of how Mao Zedong was able to organize defenses and stop the spread of Japan into China. And after World War II, many of them stayed with his side and help him take control of the country. And he's going to try to get rid of all that foreign influence that had been around for a long time. Many of Chinese people were not very happy about that. Keep in mind, China's been under some sort of foreign influence all the way. Since the Qin dynasty, which the people of China, mostly Hans, they were under the control of the Manchus, and so a lot of people had liked to see that change. Mao Zedong wants to deliver on that. So the defeat of the nationalists forced them to flee to Taipei, which most of you know more as Taiwan. And he's going to establish the People's Republic of China, which is the country that is currently what China's government is under as well. So Mao is going to bring about trying to redistribute land policies, and those are land reforms that were trying to give more land ownership to peasants, or at least accessibility to peasants. And it didn't go as planned for a lot of people who did support Mao in the beginning. The big thing, he also opened more schools, more hospitals. He was trying to modernize his country to be the great country that had been for so long of their history. And we talk about Chinese history, we're talking thousands and thousands of years. I think of history in terms of millennials, not decades like we do in our country. But Mao's going to try to nationalize the Chinese people and bring more industries. And so he, with the same ideals and principles of the Soviets' economic policies of the 5-year plans, in 1958, he's going to initiate something called the Great Leap Forward. And so part of that was that peasants' lands would be organized into communes. And basically, it would take away private property and then create state-controlled communes. And they were large agricultural communities that basically were controlled by the state, and they were set quotas and things that they needed to do. And anybody who spoke out against this idea of the communes and the redistribution of private ownership of land and so forth was rounded up and put into re-education camps, concentration camps for the most part, to basically force them to change their mind or die. And in doing this, and so many people being rounded up and put into these re-education camps, naturally what ends up happening is there are labor shortages, and then therefore food shortages that are going to exploit the problems with this policy in many ways. China, though, during this whole time where there's food shortages across the country, still wants to maintain the appearance of having everything in line. Everything's all together. China's a great country. We are doing so good with all this and everything. So to kind of maintain that appearance that everything was fine in China, they would continue to export food to other countries to show, hey, look how much food we have. We are able to send all this to you. And that just led to more people suffering from famine and other things. As a result, some 20 million people, as many as 20 million people starved in China as a result of this policy. And there's no way of confirming those numbers and such. These are, best guess, best estimated, best, research that we could, but there's no way of knowing. I've seen some numbers which may be on the exaggerated side. I have no clue, as high as 30 million people, but 20 million is roughly a pretty conservative number on that. And so the whole policy was a failure for a lot of reasons. And by 1960, the Great Leap Forward was basically abandoned. And, a lot of people's faith in communism had been shaken. So by 1966, the reforms of the Cultural Revolution are going to come. And this is Mao's attempt to try to reestablish people's faith in communism and such. And so, he starts to implicate more policies, calling for, the getting rid of other, ideologies, talking about Buddhism, talking about Confucianism, belief systems that have been around for so long. They basically start to tried to erase the influences of that in favor of something that recommits to the idea of communism. That the state is all powerful, the state is all knowing, and that's something that happens. And of course, if you didn't go along with these policies, you were sent to re-education camps. So these are just a couple of examples of the policies that were put in place in China under Mao Zedong. While China did industrialize a bit more, there was at great cost of starvation of people. So much so that it ended up leading to them being, abandoning those policies over time. So, okay. So going back to the curriculum itself, movements and redistributed land resources developed within states in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, sometimes advocating communism and socialism. So let's move on to this. We're talking about Iran. And Iran, is a very important country in world history. We didn't talk too much about the Persian Empire because that was before where our curriculum starts and such, but this has always been a major place within world history. And for Iran itself, after World War II, during World War II, Iran was occupied by mostly the British and the Soviets. Because the Germans attempted to try to get Iran onto their side during World War II because of oil. And that didn't work out for them. And the UK and the Soviets moved quickly to try to secure Iran. And just like in Europe and Korea, there was an attempt by the Soviets to try to occupy part of Iran or of all Iran and support communist governments and so forth. But Iran was so important to to world economics and everything that Harry Truman basically threatens the Soviets: if you don't get out, then we will move you by any means necessary, hint into the use of nuclear bomb. So this ends up leading to them electing the Iranians electing a government, and it was a democratically elected government, but they definitely choose a government that is not necessarily friendly to Western policies and to Western ideals, and so they wanted to avoid them dealing with a government that would not be working in their interests. So they put this whole thing, this whole coup that occurred, the first one, the person they put in charge in Iran was essentially a Western puppet, Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. He is in charge of Iran for a short time. In 1951, he is forced to flee because of an uprising. They saw him as a Western puppet, and they put in place Mohammad Mossadegh, who vowed to nationalize the oil industry. And that's where I talk about here. He's, a government that does not work in the interests of the United States, of the UK. And so both of them are going to support a coup to remove this democratically elected person and put the Shah back in power. And this is something that in Iran's history is a big reason for why there's this general distrust towards the United States. We have meddled in their elections. We've meddled in their government and, taken away their sovereignty by doing so. So the Shah himself was very friendly to the Western powers, allowing Western companies to come in and take oil and so forth. And that was something why he was allowed to rule there and supported by the U.S. and the United Kingdom. The Shah, and this is kind of the important part when it comes to this part of the curriculum, is going to institute a bunch of progressive reforms known as the White Revolution. And during this time, Iran, women were allowed the right to vote. He created social welfare systems. He created literacy programs. He's using the basic state building model of Western states. And that's something that, here in the West, we'll look at like, oh, that's good stuff, But for the people in Iran, not everyone was on board because they kind of went against their cultural ideals, and especially of those of the religious conservatives of Islam. He also attempted to buy land from landowners and then sell it to the peasants at very low cost. But this did not. This was not very successful, and altogether getting more land to people. And he became increasingly unfavorable in the eyes of landowners as he kind of felt they were being pushed off of their land in favor of this policy. So many of those landowners and many religious conservatives end up speaking out very much against the Shah. Let me cover him up. That's a good look for me right there. Oh, it doesn't say. Okay. So, lots of protests. Religious leaders like Ayatollah right here, he is going to push for the overthrow of the Shah's government. And so, yes, in 1979, there is a revolution that will topple the Shah's government. And they put in place a theocratic government that the government is largely based around Sharia law, the Islamic law. And it's one of the few examples of theocratic governments in the world today where the religion and the church are essentially one and the same. And there's a lot more to the story here that you'll learn about in AP US history. Especially with the hostages of the U.S. Embassy being taken, the U.S. Embassy being broken into and hostages taken and so forth. That's, partially the reason why, Carter doesn't get reelected because of his inability to deal with that. But I digress. So let's move on to our next one here. And this is Latin America. So Latin American countries, do have this very long history of land concentrated into the hands of the very few wealthy. This goes back to, colonialism, back when the Spanish had colonized it. You had, large tracts of land controlled by very few wealthy landowners. And then people like, the mestizos, the mulattoes, Native Americans, black slaves working this land and so forth. So there's always been this social class systems that are definitely tied to land. It wasn't just land; it was race as well, as we talked about all that in the previous units of history. The Mexican Revolution, though, when that happened, that was a big game changer, and it kind of domino affects the lots of other Latin American countries to have more policies to try to redistribute land. So a couple of examples, and not to get to do too much detail about each one of them. Venezuela. Took control of a lot of landowners' lands and redistributed it to, by the government to more people and such. But this also led to problems with squatters. And then the landowners definitely pushed back against the government, which had political repercussions for them. And so Venezuela, a lot of people look at Venezuela as a failed state, and because of socialist policies, there's a lot more context to that and understanding why Venezuela is in such a terrible place right now. It's a lot of failed government policies, but it's a long history of the inaccessibility by many of their people to get stuff that will allow them to build their wealth and create generational wealth as well, and social mobility. So Guatemala is another example, a democratically elected government that was overthrown in 1954 by the United States, who were lobbied by the United Fruit Company, who have a long history of meddling with Latin American government affairs to make sure that their interest of getting accessibility to fruits and other things they import from Latin America. Any types of land policies in the past, and Guatemala being one of the examples there, anytime there is like a government talking about land reforms and taking land away from those companies and nationalizing it and redistributing it to the common people, so forth, the United States government will come in and interfere. And so in 1954, another example of this. And the justification for this was that, hey, Cold War, we wanted to stop the the spread of communist and socialist ideals and everything. And this was a communist socialist ideal to redistribute that land, taken away from private companies in favor of the common people. So that's something that occurs in Latin America as well. Okay, so Vietnam. We're back to Vietnam. We talked about Vietnam, and we'll talk about it again at some point in this unit. We talked about how he was, became independent from Japan and the French rule and such. And then once Ho Chi Minh becomes in control of the country, starting with the North and then later all of Vietnam itself, he had many policies to try to redistribute the land. And sometimes this was done violently, killing landowners, try to remove people from control of these lands and then redistribute out to the peasants and so forth. These policies were popular with many people in Vietnam, and it's a big reason why Ho Chi Minh ends up getting a lot of support in his attempt to but in his quest to re-establish Vietnam as one single country under one government rule, and it ends up being his. Okay. All right. Ethiopia. Ethiopia is a very interesting and history for countries in Africa. It's one of the few countries that does not end up become part of the colonial territories of the European countries, minus the short little period between 1936 and 1941 when Italy takes it as a territorial claim, but it's a very short-lived claim. The person who had been in charge of Ethiopia forever was Haile Selassie. He is, in one way or another, the ruler over Ethiopia in 1916 to 1974. Starts off as a king, kind of later becomes the emperor. But for that period of time, he had pretty much been the sovereign, the person in charge, So after World War II, Selassie aligns with Western powers, and he is going to push for a lot of political reforms that are in the style and ideology of the West, more free market, democratic, but still he's the guy in charge. He did do a lot of policies that were very beneficial. However, he ends up failing in what we call land reform stuff. He wasn't able to successfully implement a redistribution of land. And so you still have this class division based off of land ownership that occurs in Ethiopia. And over time, where he's making all these promises to do these things, the policies are just generally ineffective in actually doing that. So many people in Ethiopia are calling for a change for his leadership to end by the 1960s. And so he's dealing with internal opposition that is going to eventually lead to a coup d'etat led by the military to dispose of him. And when they do, they declare themselves to be socialist, and they initiate a lot of policies similar to other communist countries of redistributing land. People don't like it. It's tough, consequences for them. And a lot of the economic policies that they put in place end up failing, and there's going to be large scale. There's my coworker again. Large scale famine and starvation across the country. So Ethiopia goes from one of the more successful African nations. The end ends up being one of the poorest and terribly humanitarian crisis that occurs there. So there's going to be another rebellion in 1991, and Ethiopia is still trying to rebuild its country, and it's taken some time. There was many people who were refugees that left Ethiopia because of a lot of these failed socialist policies that occur in Ethiopia. Okay. So then we move on to India and South Asia. In 1947, they gain independence. I've talked about that so many times now. And India is going to embark on a lot of land reforms themselves. Try to redistribute land and give more land to people who were landless, and try to undo, a lot of the effects of the social class systems that have been established for a very, very long time. And the caste system, which we've talked about briefly in history, even though it was outlawed in the 1947 election, there's still a lot of like cultural traditions that still exist, and so land distribution was essential to try to undo many of those policies and so forth. So, the whole policies, they abolish the power of the rent collectors. They protect the land renters. They promote more cooperative farming practices, and even a specific region, Kerala. I'm sure I never pronounced these right, but this region in the south here, they are going to elect essentially communist leaders, and they are going to implement certain policies that are more aligned with communism than they are with the rest of the country. And so this was allowed to an extent for some time, and it's worth noting. But some of their policies that basically tenants could purchase land from landowners, allowed tenants, people who were working the land that was owned by somebody else, to eventually work their way into becoming full-time landowners. And then the laws that they create a lot of laws that provided for fixed hours, so people weren't working longer than they should in a given day, and then also giving a minimum wage. So these policies were pretty popular and successful, but despite that, the Indian central government, basically to try to reestablish this control over the region and such, came in, got rid of that government, reversed many of the programs and policies today. So that's something that did occur. It is an example of the curriculum. So it's worth noting about, because it could be, well, not anymore, but it is part of the curriculum that we should definitely cover. So, okay. So that's it. We go back to our essential question: to what extent were land reform policies around the world successful? And then to what extent were the policies of the communist states successful in completing their goals? So think about their goals. They complete them. Was it successful in your mind? To what extent was that? Not successful, whatever. And when Canvas goes back up, we'll have you enter them on Canvas. So that's it from me and my coworker. I hope to see you guys soon. This is going to be the last video for today, and I will put more up tomorrow.